Welcome to the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast, transforming the way people think and work so their organizations can thrive. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Ed Kless, and with me today for, I believe, the third time, what I like to call our recidivist guests, is Scott Peterson. He is the Vice President of U.S. Tax Policy and Government Relations for Avalara. Welcome back to the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast, Scott Peterson.
Thank you, Ed. It's our pleasure. I look forward to it every time.
Well, we have previously talked about all things Wayfair decision, and what I'd like to get from you really is an update on how things have been progressing through the court system. Any updates to what's happening with Wayfair? Where do we stand with that case and others?
Okay, very good. So, thank you. There is, kind of a lack of litigation around Wayfair, and it surprises me because we're going on 3 years past Wayfair, and I would have thought by now, based on the shock that the Wayfair decision gave to our economy, that by now someone would have thought of some way that they were offended, and there's actually a couple things out there that states could do differently that they maybe shouldn't have done in the first place. But honestly, right now there isn't the cases that we're watching aren't specifically related to Wayfair. They're tax related, and they're sales tax, transaction tax related, but they're not really Wayfair cases. What's going on these days is Kansas and Missouri and Florida Missouri and Florida are finally, it looks like, going to pass legislation and become part of the Wayfair group. They've for a dozen different reasons haven't done anything, but now we think they're going to do some this year. Kansas has done the remote seller part of Wayfair, but never the marketplace side of Wayfair. They're going to do that this year, and we think they're actually going to put in a threshold, which they've never had before, which is a good thing because really where all of us expected the lawsuit to happen was in Kansas, because Kansas, the Department of Revenue interpreted their statute to say that everybody has to collect sales tax and there's no threshold, no exception. Every other state in the country has got some dollar threshold that you have to exceed before you start collecting the sales tax. Well, Kansas says we can't do that. And this is a big difference between an administrative agency taking an action and a legislature taking an action. The legislature there hasn't acted, so the Department of Revenue did. And we end up with this world where they have to do something and there's no exception on how small you are having to do it. But we think they're going to put in a threshold, which eliminates the risk that comes with being sued over whether or not the lack of a threshold is an undue burden on interstate commerce. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And what was so interesting about that is, and I think we talked about this last time, is that there seemed to be a relative consistency around those thresholds, but it wasn't absolutely consistent across states. And that's one place where I suppose people could complain that, hey, we're not subject to equal taxation based on these different things. But one point that I think I remember asking you, and I'm just wondering if there's been some clarity around it yet, is the notion of what qualifies as a transaction. Is it one invoice or is it, what if I have 1,000 line items on one invoice? Has there been anything that's come through with regard to that?
Oddly, no, and it's concerning.
Yeah.
and I think about this, and I try not to think about this because it's concerning. Excuse me. There's a project that's going on. It's being run by the Streamlined sales tax, which this is a very positive thing that they're doing. They're putting together a matrix of questions, and the questions that would apply to remote sellers and marketplaces. And here we are almost 3 years after Wayfair, and there are half a dozen questions on there. And what does it mean by transaction? And we're not done creating the actual questions yet. And it'll be, the summer before those get responded. So it's going to be the summer before we get absolute black and white answers from the states on what a transaction is. Now, most of them, I think, believe it is effectively a piece of paper. I give you an invoice. You make a purchase from me, whether it's one pencil or 1,000 pencils, you've made one purchase. And we believe they're all going to follow that concept that an invoice, a transaction is basically an invoice, regardless of what's on the invoice. What gets complicated is when it is a something that you buy for which there are multiple invoices. We get, well, you and I, we're in the business where we send people multiple invoices. You and I have a contract with our customers that's going to last for a year, 2 years, 3 years, but we send them a bill every month. Now, is that a separate transaction, or was the first one the transaction? Leases in the software world where we live, our customer base, we get new customers and they're living in a different spot, and we may or may not have to collect sales tax for them. If you're leasing a piece of heavy equipment, you're going to lease that to a construction company that moves it around. They're going to have it in Kentucky for 3 months, then it's going to go to Missouri for 2 months, and then they're going to put it on a train and they're going to send it to California for 6 months. Well, each of those states wants to tax that piece of equipment. And you as the lessor have to know where your piece of equipment is so that you know which sales tax to charge. Well, every one of the states is saying, well, those are all separate transactions. You may lease it. You're charging that construction company, $1,000 a day for that piece of equipment, and it doesn't make any difference to you where it's at. But from the state's perspective, the 3 months it's in Kentucky, Kentucky wants to treat those 3 months as separate transactions from the 2 months as in Missouri, and for the 6 months it's in California. So you're the lessor, and you've got an 11-month period where your piece of equipment is in 3 different states. You charge them the same amount of money every time, every month, and yet you've got to charge 3 different sales tax rates because each of those states are going to say that's a separate transaction.
It's so fascinating to me, because it sounds very similar to what I think professional athletes go through when they play X number of games in a particular state.
Yep.
Right?
That's a perfect analogy. Yep.
Yep. So, and of course, what's so interesting about this is really very solvable if you just change Nexus, right? Like if we just flip Nexus to origin and it all goes away and makes it very simple.
That would all go away. Yep. Yes, it would. We'd have different issues, but that issue.
Yeah, of course. Of course. But it would in fact, it would simplify things because it would be clear where it starts out. But yeah, there's always going to be challenges no matter what, but it certainly would create a lot of clarity. And in that way, then the state could just decide, well, this is what we're doing. Right. But they would all have to do it simultaneously, which is why it will never happen.
We're never going to go to that concept. It's too big. States don't do big things. No one does big things. I don't change, but you give me no choice. I'll adapt to whatever my 2 choices are. I'm not changing, mind you, but I will adapt to the choices you give me.
All right. Well, speaking of choices, Scott, we've had you on 3 times, and I want to ask you this question as we've asked previously. Who is a hero of yours, and why are they a hero?
Yeah, so I would struggle with this question. There's lots of people I respect and actually wish I had got to know. I just finished reading a book about Lyndon Johnson, and I would never call Lyndon Johnson a hero of mine, but his ability to size up an audience and his ability to then make whatever he wanted something they would want. I mean, he had this uncanny knack of making people appreciate his belief that they believed in the same thing. It was amazing.
I guess we call that sales.
We call that sales, and it is sales. And you get this big international leader who does this thing, and and there were lots of warts associated with that presidency. But my hero is still my grandfather. He got up every day. He had a plan for every day. He worked every day. I mean, my summers when I spent with him, we were out he was a farmer, and we were out on the farm, an hour before breakfast, and we'd come back in, and my grandmother would have this amazing breakfast for us, and then we'd be back out. And the 2 of them had such a remarkable partnership I mean, just the two of them ran this farm and lived to be quite old on the income that they earned from that farm, and never wasted a thing. I mean, everything that they had, they figured out how to reuse. And if there was something left over, or if it broke, they figured out how to make that something they could turn into something else. I was having a conversation the other day with somebody who wants to buy a freezer. They want to start buying beef in bulk. I thought, okay, let me tell you about my grandmother, and let me tell you about the freezer she had, and the rules that she had about. I mean, there's a process if you're going to have a freezer. I mean, you got to recycle things. Things got to come up off the bottom. Otherwise, it's 4 years and there's stuff on the bottom. You have no idea what it is. So to me, they were heroes because they accepted life the way it was, and they took what they got and they made the very best of it.
And lastly, Scott, how can somebody contact you?
They should. My email is scott.peterson@avalara.com. And I'm happy to, take emails. I'm probably not the right person, but I know the right people, and I'm happy to introduce folks. We do lots of things here now. I mean, we're in the transfer pricing business now, which is a whole different realm of tax that's fascinating, but it's an entirely different thing. So yeah, Scott Peterson, scott.peterson@avalara.com.
Outstanding. Scott Peterson, Vice President of U.S. Tax Policy and Government Relations for Avalara. Thanks so much for being a guest again on the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.
Thank you.
Review and subscribe by searching your podcast player of choice for Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.